Professor Kofi Agawu was born in Ghana, where he received his initial education before studying composition and analysis in the UK and musicology in the US. His work focuses on analytical issues in selected repertoires of Western Europe and West Africa. He is the author of 5 monographs, and I read them. The African Imagination in Music, published by Oxford University Press, 2016. Music as Discourse, Semiotic Adventures in Romantic Music, published by Oxford University Press, 2009. Then, Representing African Music, Postcolonial Notes, Queries, and Positions, published by Routledge, 2003. Then, African Rhythm, A Northern Ave Perspective, published by Cambridge University Press, 1995. Then, Playing with Science, A Semiotic Interpretation of Classical Music, published by Princeton University in 1991. Professor Kofi Agawu has more than 30 articles and reviews. He has received numerous awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Dent Medal, the Frank Llewellyn Harrison Medal, the Howard T. Behrman Award from Princeton University, and honorary degrees from Stellenbosch University in 2017 and Bard College in 2019. He has served on the editorial board of leading journals in musicology, music theory, African studies, and ethnomusicology. A corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He is a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Art and Sciences, honorary member of the Royal Musical Association, and adjunct professor in the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, Legon. He was music theorist in residence for the Dutch-Flemish Music Theory Society, 2008-2009, and George Eastman Visiting Professor at Oxford University, 2012 to 2013. Join me as we welcome Professor Kofi Agawu for his keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You haven't heard me speak and you're applauding. I hope you're not disappointed. So I'd like to begin by thanking the convener of this event, Dr. Ayorinde, for inviting me to participate. Thanks also to Professor Ayolabi, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Oni, the Dean of Humanities, Dr. Chukwu, Victor Chukwu, he drove us here yesterday safely, the LOC Chairman, and Dr. Oyemi, our host and head of department. Many thanks, of course, to the Chancellor of Mountaintop University, Dr. Olukoya, for making this possible. This is my first visit to MTU, and I've been impressed with what I've seen and experienced so far, including the memorable concert on Tuesday afternoon, and the papers and performances yesterday and also this morning, both in person and virtually. I would also like to acknowledge the composers present here today. Art cannot exist without the artist. Without your compositions, performers would have nothing to sing or play, and we scholars would have nothing to write about. So thank you for enabling our parasitical activities. So my paper is entitled On the Aesthetic Premises of African Pianism, and I'll read it. And I just want to warn you ahead of time. In the last 5 years, my teaching has been only to graduate students. And so it means I've been teaching advanced students, if you like, but also importantly, I can freely just throw out, say whatever I want to say, and they will run with it, they'll criticize what I say, and so on. So this paper is really a bit like a seminar paper. So if I say anything provocative, thank God you won't have a chance to respond. There's no Q&A. Okay. So within the totality of African cultural production, the proportion of works that may be claimed for art music is probably less than 5%. The genre we are considering this week, African art music, is in turn a subset of this less than 5%. I just made that up, by the way, for less than 5%. Who knows? But remember also that we have varieties of African music, such as African choralism, African symphonism, African opera, African chamber music, and of course, African pianism, which is what I'm talking about today. The justification for an event like this, the justification for devoting 3 days in July to African art music will therefore not be found in numbers. But we all know that when numbers fail, the realm of symbols is there to provide a rescue. With its considerable symbolic value, African art music has the potential to illuminate modern musical intellection and to invite comparison with the work of African writers, African artists, African filmmakers, and other creative artists. So my goal this afternoon now, it is to explicate a few of the aesthetic premises, not of African art music as a notional whole, but specifically of African pianism. I will proceed as follows. First, I'll define African pianism. Then I will outline its aesthetic premises in reference to expression of ideas through dance and folk song, and exemplification of technique through repetition and variation. Finally, I will analyze a short work of African pianism by Ghanaian composer Robert Kwame as a kind of summary example. So this is really for a musicological audience, but I don't think I have to say that to you. Yeah. So our first question has to be definitional. What is African pianism? Well, there are two influential definitions. I'll call them definition 1 and definition 2. According to definition 1, African pianism denotes the enabling constructs and entailments of a repertoire for piano or some other keyboard instrument by composers working in the European tradition of art music. This repertoire includes suites, etudes, sonatas, individual pieces with or without titles, etc., by composers from Akpabot to Zabana Congo. I had to get the A to Z in there. Or from Akinyuba through Ayobankole to Jimalabi and Bongana Ndodana Breen, just to mention a few. Definition 1 would also include works featuring the piano as an accompanying instrument, as in the art songs of Nketia or Shewun Owaje, or a partner in collaborative genres. And I just want to illustrate that second one, a partner in a collaborative genre, by playing you a little excerpt from Joshua Uzoigwe's enthralling Masquerade for Yalu and piano. This is a work from 1979, which features 2 instruments, as you will hear. So here's the Uzoigwe piece. Oh. Sorry, that's not coming through the speakers. Sorry to do this, but I'm just going to start it again because I just wanted you to hear the beginning, okay? Okay, that's enough. That's all you're going to get. But so an example of, I'm citing this as an example of African pianism, among other examples. So So that was definition one, right? Definition two narrows the meaning of African pianism to a particular style of execution. According to Akin Yuba, who originated the term, African pianism manifests an essentialized percussive mode of playing. African pianism thus involves a direct transfer of playing techniques from indigenous instruments like xylophones, thumb pianos, block lutes, drum chimes, etc., and associated polyrhythmic methods typically encountered in ensemble performance to the piano. So you transfer the techniques to the piano. To the composition student, a teacher might say, write for the piano in a way that mimics the beating of a drum, the scraping of a gonje, the plucking of an mbira, or the banging on a xylophone. Akin Yuba's reasoning was that traditional music is always already percussively conceived, that's his phrase. So it would be an easy, culturally defensible step to make this transfer to our new toy, the piano. Indeed, according to him, the piano, this European-Italian invention dating from 1701, quote, possesses latent African characteristics, end of quote. And the term African pianism, as you all know, has been appropriated by others, Nketia, 1994, Labi, 1994, Omojola, 2003, Eric Moe, 2021, Rebecca Omordia, 2022, and so on. In short, definition one is open. It embraces any and all usages of the piano for African composition, irrespective of mode of execution. Definition two, which is more marked, as linguists would say, restricts genuine African pianism to a specific percussive manifestation. Now, I don't think we need to split hairs over definitions of African pianism this afternoon, but it might be helpful to briefly recall the context of the term's emergence in Akin Yuba's own thinking. According to him, African pianism came into his creative consciousness around 1970. Elsewhere he says late 60s, but what's a few years between friends? But it wasn't until 1989 that he gave the concept full airing in a by now canonical essay entitled Intercultural Expressions in Neo-African Art Music, which we should all have read, and if you haven't read it, well, shame on you. In this groundbreaking exercise, Yuba did things. First, he identified antecedents to what he termed African pianism in the music of composers such as Halim El-Dab, Ayo Bankole, and Gamal Abdel Rahim. Second, he postulated four technical features of African pianism: thematic repetition, direct borrowings of thematic material from African traditional sources, use of rhythmical or tonal motifs based on traditional idioms, and percussive treatment of the piano. All four are pertinent and readily heard in the repertoire. Note, however, that only one of these features, number 4, namely percussive treatment of the piano, refers specifically to the instrument. So what Yuba was trying to do in 1989 was to gather a constellation of emergent practices under a new name. By naming the phenomenon, he would enable the cultivation of an institutional discourse and eventually stake a place for African pianism among modern compositional initiatives. I think we can say that a symposium like this one contributes in its own way to the realization of Akin Yuba's vision. May I suggest, however, that the essentializing of a percussive approach to piano playing proves ultimately restrictive. For one thing, it would include works by African composers that do not manifest a pervasively percussive mode. For example, listen to, if you like, the reflective opening of Bongani Ndodana Breen's work for solo piano called Flowers in Sand. I'll play this. I don't like playing this kind of music after lunch for obvious reasons, but just listen to a few. It started. can't be in a hurry for this kind of music. You just have to wait for the composer. The ego is up there. It's nothing to entrain to. It's just listen to it, and so on. There are other examples of this kind of reflective, slow, I'm in control kind of music. I would have played you maybe Nkeru Okoye's Dusk, for example, Nketiah's Dagomba, and so on. I do, however, since I haven't run out of time yet, want to play you just a little bit of a composer I discovered just recently, Algerian composer Nabil Benab Del Jalil, born in 1972. Now I'll just play a little bit of Nabil Benab Del Jalil's Nocturne. This is a nocturne. It's played by Rebecca Omordia. And so on, yeah. It has that Eastern, sort of North African flavor. All right. Okay, so I'm going to be playing a lot of music this afternoon, I'm afraid. So if you don't like music, well, there's not much I can do about that. So even the archetypal pounder of the piano, Jimal Labi, sometimes deploys a critical, a lyrical and reflective tone that has little percussive character. Here's a passage from his composition, a piece called Earth Beats, and I'm going to have to... Okay, so this is what I feared, that I would give away my secret. But here is a little bit from Jimal Labi. Just a lyrical passage, has elements of Akan melody. And so it's called Earth Beats. Yeah? Of course, I'm being a little disingenuous here because what you just heard is the contrasting lyrical passage from Earth Beats. This is a work, by the way, written in the same year in which Akin Yuba was consolidating his term African Pianism. Now, the work, in fact, begins in the aggressive, in-your-face manner that Labi sometimes adopted, and I have to hit you with that. So here it is. Okay, so clearly the percussive label would not be out of place here, you would agree. But African composers are hardly the sole exponents of a percussive approach to the piano. Compare Jimal Labi's assertiveness to that of Galina Utsvolskaya, a Russian composer, female composer, dates are 1919 to 2006, a composer noted for creating ritualistically repetitive music. Here's the beginning of her sixth piano sonata, written in 1988, also around the same time that Ayuba was formulating his concept and Labi was writing Earth Beats, with the pianist Marino Formenti pounding the hell out of the piano. So there's more savagery here than anything I've heard in African pianism. And incidentally, I could have played you any number of pieces by Bartók and others. Yeah? In short, basing a definition of African pianism on immanent characteristics may be misleading. Doubtless, some idea of immanence will invariably be in play, but it might be wise to release the spirit of aspiration and allow for other modes of execution in what is, after all, a fledgling practice in this subgenre. How about the piano as an instrument that talks or raps in a syllabic African manner, or sings like a griot? Female, yeah? Okay. So now I come to the aesthetic premises of African pianism. Here too, let me begin with a definition. By aesthetics, in this specifically African context, I am not referring to bourgeois conceptions of the beautiful in art, or to taste, or to sensuous perception, or anything like that. I'm not quoting anyone here. This is my own definition, by the way. I simply mean the collective affordances for creativity rooted in an ethos beholden to communality and to a will to truth that guides but does not limit the scope of individual expression and whose outputs are judged to be meaningful. Normally, I would circulate this definition and then we could talk about it for a half hour, but I'm sure you all found it very transparent. It would be quite impossible to unpack all the dimensions of the aesthetic lodged in the plurality of African creativity. So let me just isolate two aspects for very brief discussion. So every work of African pianism that I know does two things. One, it expresses an idea or a constellation of ideas, and two, it exemplifies a technique while also disclosing its reliance on techne. So let me take those two in turn. Expresses an idea. The ideas expressed in a work of African pianism have many sources and take many forms, but two of the commonest are one, dance, and two, folk song. And let me again take each in turn. Dance. As is well known, our continent is blessed with a multitude of dance forms. For us, dance is life-giving and life-affirming. But just as living itself indexes the communal, dance follows a similar imperative. We normally dance together, not individually. Dancing individually means dancing with imagined others. Finally, dance as a mode of expression speaks to a level of comfort with our bodies, a somatic freedom, if you like. It is not surprising that many works of African pianism feature dance, either directly in their titles or by invocation in the manner of topoi. So there are titles like Fred O's 24 Studies in African Rhythms, which has Raging River dances, Bakwere dance, Herero dance, Aye dance, Agbaja dance, and so on. That's Fred O. In 1999, Joshua Uzoigwe wrote Nigerian Dance No. 1 and Egwu Amala, included it in his collection, Talking Drums. Bodo Modula's 2003 collection, Studies in African Pianism, includes two Nigerian dances, and Agidimo Dance No. 1, Agidimo Dance No. 2, and so on. Yeah, so the dance is thematized quite often. Secondly, the invocation of dance as topoi. In addition to works with named dances in their titles, there are others that incorporate dance as a rhetorical topos. So Kwabena Nketiah's Volta Fantasy, for example, incorporates the timeline associated with the Southern Ebe dance, Agbaja. Fredo has written an etude for piano invoking or even recreating this dance. And if we look for a moment beyond piano music, we could mention Ayo Oluronti's Ina Erin and George Dawes' Fraternity Suite. Both incorporate topoi from high life dance. Akinyuba's polystylistic opera Chaka includes material lifted from the canonized dances Adwa and Achagbako of Akan and Ebe provenance, respectively. You know, I sometimes mention names and titles even instead of just confining them to a list, because there is a sort of potency in naming that we underestimate when we are rushing to get to the theoretical point. I want the theory, give me the theory, But I want us to focus on the phenomena themselves. So I suspect that some of you know these works and will be able to generate a discussion from them. Now, the dance element in African pianism is generally not meant to elicit physical dancing in the concert hall. Even where a drum accompanies the piano, as in Yuba's Ore Meta or Uzoigwe's Ukom, the music is meant to elicit contemplation. If you're familiar with the specific dance being referenced or with related dances, or if you recognize a generic dance element, all of these may stimulate contemplation and release personal or shared associations. Without implying that these works are trapped in mimesis, however, we may reasonably postulate a choreographic supplement as an essential feature of African pianism, and therefore as one of its aesthetic premises. Then folk song. So a second source for expressing a compositional idea or constellation of ideas in African pianism is folk song or folk material. Folk songs may be actual, that is obtained from ethnographic sources, or invented, that is fabricated in conformity with the grammar of indigenous folk song, a kind of pastiche. The practice of constructing a work of art music from folk material is of course well known. By now it's a global practice. So in the European so-called classical tradition, we see it in Beethoven and Brahms and Berio and Britten, if you just want to stick with the B's. But we also see it in the music of the so-called nationalist composers of the 19th century, like Dvorak and Grieg and others, Stravinsky being one of them. And we will be hearing a set of folk songs by Seun Owaje, I think tomorrow's concert, and the lucky recipient of a publication of his, which features these folk songs. So it's one of the ways in which people express ideas. But why have African composers drawn upon the realm of the folk? Folk indexes home, the local, mother tongue, and the primordial. The appeal of folk music for composers of art music stems in part from a set of stereotypical and self-serving associations, projections, and fantasies that often provide hermeneutic windows for interpreters. Here are some popular characterizations, often framed as binaries. Folk music is said to be of ancient origins or even timeless. It thus has historical depth and is materially authentic. Art music, by contrast, is new, is different, it bears a contemporary stamp or a modern stamp, and is suspiciously alien or alienating or even inauthentic. Folk music is communal as opposed to individual, anonymously composed rather than composed by a named individual, natural, or at least close to nature, rather than contrived or artificial, and not as serious or as high as art music. Now, if you're getting ready to menace these binaries, don't worry, I will do it before you do it. These are extremely fragile binaries, of course, but I mention them because even though they are sedimented at different degrees of depth in the work of African composers, they suggest a doubleness at the heart of the African pianism project that is irreducible and ineliminable. It occurred to me that Baudel's inner and outer self resonated a little bit with what I'm calling a doubleness in this paper. But anyway, you can deny it if you want. They remind us that in this rarefied world in which trained composers strain to express musical ideas, the notional warmth or assurance of a supposed folk song, here an index for all things home, local, authentic, is strongly desirable, not merely for affective reasons, but actually for their structural and technical potentialities as well. The other thing that every work of African pianism does is exemplify a technique or disclose its reliance on technique. Perhaps the most basic technique is repetition. You may recall that the first of Akin Yuba's list of 4 devices associated with African pianism concerns thematic repetition. There is an entire catalog of devices waiting to be compiled, ranging from exact or varied repetition and ornamentation to the most radical transformations. Of course, all musical traditions invest in repetition, so it may seem somewhat lame to single it out for African pianism. But if we distinguish the structural necessity of repetition from its rhetorical uses, we can better appreciate the prevalence, the depth, and the creativity in its diverse African usages. I actually think it would be good to have a symposium sometime on repetition. Just devote the entire 3 days to repetition. No decoloniality. Again, constraints of time will not allow us to do more than sample repetition. So here is Uzoegwe's Agbigbo. This is a work in what I would call a minimalist vein, deploying characteristic pentatonic intervals, fourths, seconds, thirds in the melody. And I'll just play you a little bit of this so you can see. This is like a feast in repetition. Yeah. And so on, yeah, you get the point. Again, you can't be in a hurry for this. You just have to join the groove, right? Here's just for contrast, another example. This is Christian Onyeji's Ufie, an example of what he calls a dramistic composition. I'll just play you a little bit of this. I think most of you know it. So on, yeah. So if, and again, I could have played you hundreds of examples here featuring this kind of insistent repetition. So if repetition represents the first syntactic impulse, the second would be variation, or repetition with a difference. In constructing the catalog I mentioned a moment ago, a special place would be reserved for what might be called a variational impulse, or even a will to variation. This species of repetition, which serves as an animating feature of African oral composition in general, involves tweaking, reimagining, adding encomiums, or in local parlance we would say, putting style in it. Formal displays of variation impulse in African pianism abound. Examples too numerous to cite, but again, Bankole's Egum variations in G major, Gamal Abdel Rahim's variations on an Egyptian folk song, and several others. In fact, if you were at the concert on Tuesday, you would have heard Modupe Kachi sing "Great is Thy Faithfulness" with amazing use of variation in it. One of the nice things being, sorry Modupe, that's you. One of the nice things about being at a conference that combines performance with scholarly reflection is that we can refer to the things that we are listening to immediately instead of talking when the music examples are playing. Okay, so forgive me, that was below the belt. We will experience the workings of a variation principle in my final example, but let me state here that the repetition imperative exists in tension with the will to variation. In its constancy, the repetition imperative serves as a ground or foundation, a communal and welcoming meeting place, while the will to variation indexes the realm of artifice, the composer artwork, the display of acquired technique. Ultimately, it betrays the intrusion of an ego. My final point about technique. Technique in African composition can both be an end and a means to an end. In other words, a musical idea and the means of its expression while notionally different, may sometimes be indistinguishable from each other. When in his piece Masquerade, Uzoigwe foregrounds the speech mode through a dialogue between Iyalu and piano, he is expressing a constellation of ideas about executing sameness across different instrumental timbres. The piano is made to speak not metaphorically, but literally. So I just remind you of that piece again here. This is Uzoigwe's Masquerade. So they're imitating one another, right? The drum and the piano. And so on. So because the drum's patterns carry semantic baggage, we can hear technique as a means of conveying a recoverable message, a translatable message. At the same time, the composer is laying bare the piano's speaking potential, a display that therefore realigns this ostensibly European instrument with the numerous African instruments that talk. And I just recently heard a talk by Bode, my colleague here, about the dundun playing a pianistic pattern. I think he was talking about Cheung's groove for the master drummer. Is that your piece? Yeah, okay. Very nice piece. There are other examples. In fact, we heard an example again with Oluronti's Ilu Baye yesterday, which Lisa Olubaje. Ilu Baje, yeah. Ilu Baje, yeah. Which Lisa sang for us very effectively yesterday. Examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, no discussion of African pianism would be complete without addressing the issue of pitch organization. This is, in fact, the elephant in the room. In Akinyuba's 1989 gloss on African pianism, repetition and polyrhythm were mentioned, but not harmony or tonality. Nkitia, in 1994, said that the harmonic idiom of African pianism, quote, may be tonal, atonal, consonant, or dissonant in whole or in part, depending on the preferences of the composer, the mood or impressions he wishes to create, or how he chooses to reinforce, heighten, or soften the jaggedness of successive percussive attacks, end of quote. I read that prejudicially because it's so general, so liberal, and I think ultimately somewhat backwards. But it was Uzoigwe, writing in 2005, specifically about his own piece, Talking Drums, who announced a desire to, quote, establish a relevant tonal language for modern African music by borrowing a leaf from African traditional music, end of quote. The crucial word there is relevant. And for this composer-thinker, the pursuit of relevance would lead him to potentialities inscribed in African traditional music. It would in turn have us looking for inspiration from, for example, the treatment of dissonance in traditional music, including such procedures as part singing in parallel seconds that Uluronte was mentioning today among the Ekiti. Now, I think, and I'm not going to go on at length about pitch organization, but let me just mention for the record 3 methods of pitch organization which occur frequently in the repertoire I'm talking about. First, of course, is tonality. Second is atonality. And third is modality. And I'll just leave it at those 3. Tonality and atonality are of foreign origins, while modality is of indigenous origins. And I'm not saying anything about whether you should use them or not. This is just a genealogical exercise, but it's worth being reminded of what is of local origin and what is of foreign origin. We don't have time to explore the rich possibilities of modal harmony, But I want to make just one comment on the tonal-atonal dichotomy. I have to be very careful here because I'm at Mountaintop University. But the original tonal sin began with putting your fingers on the keyboard to play chords in 4-part harmony. Undoubtedly, this brought pleasure to many musicians. I have not located a comparable historical moment for the practice of atonality, but it appears that some composers opted for atonality and serialism, Akin Yuba, for example, not because that sound world had any evident appeal to African audiences, not because their consistently dissonant sonorities resonated with the flexible hierarchies of indigenous modal systems, but because the use of atonality or 12-tone systems placed such composers in the company of the European avant-garde, then held as the most prestigious European school of composition in the early 20th century. Now, while we await a serious study of indigenous tone systems, we can agree, I hope, that given where we are historically today, the uncritical use of tonality, the kind that Nketia advocated, and the merely symbolic use of atonality both leave something to be desired. Perhaps we can explore some other affordances, but I'll just leave that out. So you cannot be uncritical towards tonality, and you cannot just merely symbolically use atonality. I say you cannot. I mean, who am I to say you cannot? But you know what I mean. I'm just... all right. So my final example here. I want to conclude this talk with a few remarks about a short work of African pianism by Robert Kwame. It's called January Dance. It was composed in 2001, so it's in our century. And it's performed here by William Chapman Yaho. Although it's a relatively simple, just 3-minute piece, January Dance has the virtue of foregrounding several of the aesthetic premises that we've been talking about. So it can therefore serve conveniently as a summary example. I'm trying to be a good teacher here, and a point of reference for discussion and debate. This is going to be done entirely orally because I know you all have sharp ears. So I'll just play a segment of the music, comment on it, play another segment, and so on. Hopefully you'll agree with everything I say, even before I say it. Here's the beginning of Robert Kwame's January Dance. You're going to hear a timeline that is activated immediately, as you would in a traditional performance. Then a song. This is associated with the dance. Kwanlogo is a Gan song. The Kwanlogo song you will hear on the piano, and we'll call this T1, okay? And then the tune itself will unfold in just 4 little phrases. All this will become clear, and I won't go into the properties of them. But here's the beginning of January Dance by Robert Kwame. There's the tune with the first phrase. This is the second phrase. And this is the third phrase. And this is the final phrase. Okay, so that was T1. This is 2. Second phrase. Third phrase. You would think T2 would end there, but what he does is to take the third and the fourth phrases, almost like a little codetta, and then he comes to life in the codetta. So you'll hear it 3 and 4, and then 3 and 4 reharmonize. He's doing things in the codetta section, in the margins, if you like. So I'll play you the rest of T2. That's the third phrase, and this is the last phrase. Brings you down to the low C. Harmonizes it. It's almost codetta-like, but he adds these thirds. Okay, this is a waiting. He's waiting till he activates T3, almost like a fanfare. That's T3. repeats the third and fourth phrases again. Now we are in T4. Don't worry, there are only 5 of them. This is 4. And he's building the accompaniment in T4 so that there are all these trichords that he throws into the inner voices. So this is the end of T4. And you can hear it even in the lower registers. This is T5, this is the last one. And he's put the tune in the bass voice. And let me read you what I say here. The offbeat surroundings continue as before. Register is expanded, dynamics increase towards a triple forte, and we are transported to, I don't know where. But what started as a simple song accompanied by a popular timeline pattern and even sporting a childlike ambience has now been transformed again into something else. And just, if you're still awake before the end, the climax of January Dance comes at the end, not before the end. As we near the end, listeners are swept along by the work mode in poetic terms, and this displaces our analytical reliance on the presentational modes conveyed by phrase structure, purposeful tonicization, and the distinction between dissonance as means and consonance as arrival. Indeed, pianists frequently pedal through the last few bars to enhance this sense of what you might call, somewhat grandly, a pan-parametric process. And let's just hear this ending. This is third phrase. Registers are expanding. So that's a work from 2001. And I want to remember Robert Kwame here because he was my classmate and my friend and colleague for many years. He unfortunately passed away. So Robert Kwame's January Dance is a repository, if you like, of resources and devices associated with African pianism, the piano, a percussive mode, dance, polyrhythm, folk material, embroidery, a variational impulse, a residual doubleness, and a blurring of the distinction between idea and technique. So to summarize and to conclude, there is obviously a great deal more to say about African pianism, and it's great that we have in attendance a mix of composers, performers, and scholars to help us explore the topic. I want to close by just reiterating the point I made at the outset, namely that the term African pianism emerged as a label for recognizing the work of a handful of composers of African art music. Akin Yuba's intervention was a bid for institutional power. It was a way of giving voice to the ostensibly underappreciated promulgators of a tradition of African music composition, a tradition which was at birth intertwined with Europe, and which came to embody one of several competing articulations of African modernity. Labels are useful in providing orientation, of course, but labels may also confine, mislead, undercomplicate, which is why I have suggested that we be alert to the danger of essentializing African writing for piano. So from my brief enumeration of strategies such as expressing an idea through dance and folk song, displaying technique through repetition and a variational impulse, and possibly pursuing an indigenous pitch relational system, which I didn't talk about, but it would be a language-derived tonality, we can see that the aesthetic core of African pianism remains contingent. The aesthetic premises are irreducibly plural. Ideally, the designation African pianism would inspire further pursuit of what Achille Mbembe calls disenclosure. The transfer of playing techniques from indigenous instruments to the piano, for example, would not be binding or put the composer in an enclosure. That's what it would do. Rather, it would be offered as one of several possibilities for composing for the piano within a matrix of disenclosure. And we would continue to pursue that elusive balance between the acquisition of skill through rigorous training and enclosure and the expression of creative freedom under a regime of disenclosure. So thank you for listening. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, let's do more, please. We can't just stop like that, please.
No.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a pity there's no Q&A because I'm sure many people have things they want to quarrel about.
There is no Q&A, but we are going to have just 10 minutes or 15-minute break where people can engage, and later they can see your tea breaks and ask questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully, perhaps it might eventually land this. It can enter into a publication that will definitely be shared across the world.
Agreed.
Yeah. But for now, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you.